Have you ever wondered what a child would be able to do to save the life of the one they love? How many times do we judge someone without even imagining the pain that is behind a simple gesture? Today, you will learn the story of an orphan girl of only 9 years old who faced cold, hunger and abandonment but carried a secret with her. Every day he discreetly left the restaurant where he worked, taking scraps of hidden food. But why? And what did she risk by doing that? It is at these times that life surprises us with powerful lessons about love, sacrifice and courage. Have you ever felt like you had to do something impossible for someone you love? If this story has already started to touch your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Because what happened next? You won't believe it. She was only 9 years old, too small for so much responsibility, but big enough to carry the weight of a life that many adults would not bear. On the grey streets of that cold city, surrounded by tall buildings and illuminated windows that seemed untouchable, he walked every morning with hurried steps and a watchful eye. Winter punished the thin skin of his arms, which had no more than a shabby coat, too old to protect from the icy wind that cut like a blade. While people hurried by, going about their own routines, she remained invisible, as if she were part of the city's forgotten landscape. Each day was a silent battle. The girl crossed busy streets until she reached the small restaurant where she worked cleaning tables. I didn't earn much. In fact, what I received was barely enough to maintain the minimum of dignity, but it was enough not to give up. In that heated room, the smell of fresh food filled the air. Full plates came and went in the hurried hands of the waiters. Customers chatted, smiled, discussed business, or simply enjoyed their meals without noticing her presence, who sneaked between tables collecting dirty plates, empty glasses, and crumpled napkins. There was a silence inside her, a forced calm, that hid the whirlwind of worries. As he cleaned each table, his eyes discreetly searched for something, food scraps that could be used. Small pieces of bread, an untouched potato, a piece of meat forgotten in the corner of the plate. All that had value. A lot of value. More than any tip forgotten on the table. It was food, and food, for her, meant hope. Behind that childish look, there was a secret, something that few would be able to understand. At the end of each day, with careful hands, she separated what she could gather and, very carefully, hid it inside a small cloth wrapped in her old backpack. He left the restaurant as if nothing was happening, always with the same serene countenance, almost rehearsed, trying not to attract anyone's attention. The city was already plunged into darkness when she left the restaurant. The lights of the lampposts formed orange circles on the asphalt, wet by the fine drizzle. The elongated shadows accompanied her along the damp sidewalks. Despite the constant fear, his steps were firm. He knew every shortcut, every dark alley, every silent corner. Out of the neighborhood where he lived, there was no room for error. Any slip could put everything to waste. As he walked, the noise of the cars gradually decreased. The grand avenues gave way to narrow alleys and quiet alleys. The cold seemed even more biting there. The houses, many of them improvised, made of wood, canvas, and stacked bricks, barely protected from the wind that blew insistently. The path ended at a small shack at the end of a dimly lit alley. It was there that he lived with his younger brother, the real reason behind every little piece of food he carried hidden. The shack had only one room. The makeshift walls creaked with every gust of wind. The dirt floor was covered with pieces of cardboard and a threadbare blanket where the brother rested. He, frail and thin, fought against a disease that advanced day after day, while his small body lost strength. No doctors, no medicines, no help. Just her sister, trying in every way to stay strong enough to take care of both of them. The girl knew she couldn't count on anyone. I had heard many close their doors when I sought help. Therefore, she found in those food scraps the chance to keep her brother fed and perhaps postpone the advance of the disease for another day. Each piece of bread, each spoonful of rice meant one more sigh, one more day. As the world took its course, she fought every day a silent battle, where love for her brother was the only force that kept her standing. But what she didn't know is that in that restaurant, someone began to observe her movements. Small details began to attract attention. The quick exits, the careful looks, the way he hid his backpack always in the same way before leaving. The owner of the restaurant, a man accustomed to being suspicious of anything that could harm his business, began to notice those subtle gestures. At first he thought it was just an impression, but as the days passed, something didn't feel right. Small leftovers of food disappeared from the trays before being taken to the trash. The other employees didn't seem to notice, but he, always attentive, began to be suspicious. The doubt grew. Was the girl stealing? Could it be that behind that fragile appearance there was a hidden intention? Thoughts tormented him as he watched her, surreptitiously collect the dishes and always leave with the same carefully closed backpack. It was something small, almost insignificant, but enough to sow distrust. One day, after the end of the workday, the owner of the restaurant made a decision. I wanted to find out what was really happening. Without telling anyone, he waited for the girl to leave, keeping a safe distance. He followed in his footsteps through the cold, silent streets, determined to unravel the mystery. What he would find that night, however, was far beyond anything he could have imagined. If you are feeling the weight of this story like me, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city you are watching. The wind that night seemed to carry not only the cold, but also memories too heavy to fit in a child's memory. Each step the girl took, guided by the shadows of the city, brought out what had brought her there. His story had begun years earlier, when what was left of an ordinary childhood was brutally and definitively torn away. She didn't know a life full of toys, laughter, and hugs. His childhood was shaped by the early loss of his parents, victims of a rapid and devastating illness, so that left no time for goodbyes or promises of protection. With no one in the family to take them in, she and her brother were thrown to the margins of life. First came the improvised shelters, then the nights on the street. Each new day, a new battle for a corner where they could hide from the rain and cold. The little hands learned early to look for food in the leftovers of others, to ask with their eyes for what words no longer had the strength to beg. Her brother, still a baby, depended on her for everything. Her fragile little eyes stared at her with a painful confidence, as if in those small hands lay their entire future. In time they found shelter in a small shack at the end of a forgotten alley in the city. 4 rotten wooden walls, a few poorly, fitted tiles and a shabby blanket served as a home. There, the girl learned to turn a little into enough, even when her stomach growled and the wind came in through cracks that never seemed to close. The fragility of her brother, increasingly ill, weighed on her shoulders as a responsibility she had never chosen, but which she embraced with the strength of someone who knows there is no other option. The nights were long. Often the girl would sit in the corner of the small room, watching over her brother's restless sleep, while his body trembled with fever that insisted on returning. There were no medicines. There were no doctors. Only wet cloths and silent prayers filled the void of hope. She felt the constant fear that, at any moment, the little one might not resist. And it was this fear that made her get up each morning, put on her thin coat, and go to the restaurant, where at least there was a chance of getting something to keep him fed. The work began almost by chance, when the owner of the restaurant, seeing her insistence on asking for a job, decided to let her clean the tables at the end of the shifts. It was not charity. It was a cheap workforce that did not ask questions or make demands. To the girl, however, it meant everything. It meant food. It meant surviving. Each dish removed from the tables was examined carefully. A piece of bread, some potatoes, a piece of meat that the customer left aside. Every leftover was a silent victory. As customers chatted, ate, and laughed, she watched the world away from them. A world of well-dressed adults, full plates and conversations that seemed to belong to another reality. She did not feel envy, but rather an almost insurmountable distance between her existence and that abundance. The restaurant was a stage where she danced backstage, invisible to the eyes of those who were there. No one really saw her. She was just the cleaning girl, the one who came and went every day, without causing disturbance, without taking up space. When the workday ended, his real mission began. With her backpack carefully adjusted, she left the restaurant with hurried steps. She knew that she could not delay, that the cold was increasing, and that her brother was waiting for her with his eyes dimmed, but still hopeful. As he walked, he felt the weight of his backpack as a physical reminder of his responsibility. With every turn she made through the streets of the city, a part of her story seemed to whisper in her ear, reminding her of how it had all begun and why she couldn't stop. His brother's illness did not let up. The days when he could eat a little more were the best. When her fever subsided, the temporary relief made her believe that she was somehow winning that unequal battle. But on the bad days, when the little one could barely open his eyes, she felt overwhelmed by the powerlessness of not being able to do more. There were no adults to share the burden, there were no neighbors offering help. It was just the two of them, isolated in a world that seemed indifferent to the suffering of forgotten children. The savings, small coins he managed to save with work, were not enough to buy real food, much less medicine. So the restaurant's leftovers have become the fine line between life and despair. She learned to choose carefully, to pick up what was still clean and usable. I wrapped everything with old cloths to maintain some of the temperature and prevent it from spoiling before I got home. He knew that every crumb counted. On the way back, he watched the lights of distant houses where families dined at abundant tables. Those images entered her mind not as envy, but as a portrait of something she had never experienced. The concept of home, of protection, of a safe lap, was something I knew only from the stories that my mother used to tell before falling asleep when they were still a complete family. Now the only family left depended exclusively on her. With each new day, the routine repeated itself like an endless cycle. Work, leftover food, the silent walk through the dark streets, the cold shack, the sick brother, the constant struggle to postpone the worst. But even in the face of all this, there was an astonishing strength within her, a protective instinct that was not shaken, even when physical fatigue and fear threatened to overwhelm her. She knew she couldn't falter. Her brother needed her awake, strong, determined, and as long as there was a single piece of bread to bring home, she would move on. The people who crossed his path daily at the restaurant never imagined what would happen after the kitchen lights went out. To many, she was just an orphan girl, trying to earn a few bucks. No one saw the full story. No one saw her brother's pleading gaze waiting for her night after night. No one felt the weight of responsibility that fell on those small shoulders. And most of all, no one knew how far she was willing to go to make sure her brother had another day to live. As darkness enveloped the city on that particular night, and the owner of the restaurant followed her in the distance, he walked without, knowing that he was about to witness something that would change not only what he thought about this girl, but also the very way he saw the world around him. The routine that seemed immutable took a new turn on the day when, taken by courage and need, the girl knocked on the back door of a busy restaurant in the city center. His eyes carried the urgency of someone who no longer had any alternatives. Her dirty hands and small body conveyed the fragility of a childhood marked by daily struggle, but her firm posture demonstrated that, even at a young age, she carried the weight of a responsibility that many adults had never experienced. He did not ask for alms, nor did he beg for charity. He only asked for work. Anybody. I wanted the chance to earn some coins honestly, even though I knew that no one saw a future or value in a child alone. The owner of the restaurant, occupied with the concerns of the business, gave him a quick glance as if evaluating an object of little interest. She was always looking for ways to save on labor, and faced with such a cheap and silent offer, she saw in the girl the opportunity of someone who would not ask questions, nor demand much. He assigned him the function of cleaning the tables after hours without contact with customers, away from the watchful eyes of the inspectors. There was no contract, no fixed salary, no guarantees. Just a few coins left at the end of the night, and the promise to return the next day. The restaurant was a stark contrast to the girl's life. The glass doors opened automatically to welcome well-dressed customers who arrived in luxurious cars, chatting about business, travel, and parties. Inside, the warm lighting created a welcoming atmosphere for those who could afford the carefully prepared meals. The colorful and hearty dishes paraded through the agile hands of the waiters who circulated between the tables naturally. The ambient music, the smell of spices, and the sound of conversations gave the place an air of lightness that seemed to belong to another world. Meanwhile, The girl moved like a shadow between the tables. She went unnoticed by most customers, who hardly noticed her presence. It was as if it were part of the furniture, an unimportant detail in the elegant setting of the restaurant. The older employees, accustomed to her silent presence, spoke little to her. There were those who treated her with indifference, others with a certain disdain disguised as tolerance, but most simply ignored it, as if the small thin body that collected dirty plates and empty glasses had no face or history. At each end of the meal, when customers left leftovers untouched on the plates, the girl's eyes were filled with hope. While discreetly cleaning the tables, he quickly evaluated what could be used: a whole loaf of bread, a portion of rice intact, a few slices of meat still good. Everything was carefully placed in a small plastic bag that he carried hidden inside the worn backpack. The gesture was quick, trained by practice and the constant fear of being discovered. Customers chatted animatedly as she performed her invisible task. They commented on recent trips, promising businesses, expensive gifts they bought for their children, without imagining that right next door, a child was struggling to gather the crumbs that would feed his sick brother that night. There was an immense abyss between those realities, as if they existed in different dimensions, separated by an invisible barrier of indifference. The waiters, always rushed with orders, cared little about what she did after the food left the tables. They were more concerned with tips and the next customer to be served. The cooks, on the other hand, hidden in the rush of the hot kitchen, rarely saw the girl. She circulated in the room lightly, always trying not to disturb the flow of the restaurant, always avoiding being noticed beyond what was necessary. The cold of the street seemed even more intense when she finally left the restaurant, with the small treasure of leftovers hidden in her backpack. Every morsel of food was, to her, more valuable than any money she could receive. He knew that when he got home, his brother could have a little sustenance and perhaps enough strength to face another day. The girl did not see in that act a mistake but a necessity. She was not stealing for herself, but saving what she could for those who depended completely on her. The indifference with which the adults treated her reinforced a constant feeling of invisibility. She was not seen as a child in a situation of despair, but as a functional piece within that commercial mechanism. His story, his pains, and his motives were of no interest to anyone, and so, day after day, she became an expert at being unnoticed. The less attention he was, the more chances he had of following through with his silent plan for survival. While the restaurant closed its doors every night, leaving behind the smell of fresh food and clean tables, the girl went about her exhausting routine. The route to the shack was always the same, and the care with every detail of his departure was calculated. He avoided crossing acquaintances, avoided curious eyes, and walked with his head down, as if trying to disappear into the shadows of the city. All to protect that little shipment of hope. But even with all his ability to go unnoticed, there was something changing in the last few days. Subtle movements that previously did not attract attention now began to be noticed by an attentive eye. Unknowingly, his steps were being watched with increasing interest. Small details, which until then had gone unnoticed by the owner of the restaurant, began to form a picture that instigated his distrust. It was only a matter of time before he decided to follow the clues that formed before his eyes. Each night, as the last customers left the restaurant and the lights were turned off one by one, the girl began her silent and calculated ritual. His eyes, attentive and trained, swept the tables in search of the precious opportunities that would make all the difference when he got home. It was not a simple or unpretentious task. Every movement needed to be fast, precise, and invisible. The risk of being caught hung over her shoulders like a heavy, ever-present, ever-threatening shadow. One mistake, one small slip, and everything could come crashing down. Losing your job meant much more than missing out on a few coins. It was losing the only source of sustenance that kept his brother alive. The small and agile hands learned, day after day, to select what was still good. I couldn't take any leftovers. The bread still intact, the rice portions untouched, the fruit left in the breakfast baskets, and on lucky days, small pieces of meat forgotten on the plates. There were days when I found a little more, and others when I could barely muster enough for a modest meal. Even so, each fragment of food represented an intimate and silent triumph. The trick was in the controlled repetition of gestures. As he cleaned the tables, the tea towel hid the quick transfer of leftovers to the small folded plastic bag hidden inside the old backpack. The eyes constantly scanned around, making sure that no employee or customer was paying attention. Everything was done between a plate removed and a tray collected, in perfect synchrony between routine and need. The naturalness of his movements was such that, to an inattentive observer, it all seemed part of the simple act of clearing the table. The fear of being discovered was constant. All it would take is a careful look at the wrong moment, a misstep, and the whole strategy would collapse. She knew that. Therefore, his breathing became more restrained, and his heart beat faster with each small successful operation. There was no room for relaxation, not even on days when the hall was emptier. The tension lived in every small gesture, as if at any moment someone could appear behind her and interrupt that fragile survival scheme. Behind every piece of food saved, there was something much bigger than hunger. There was love. A love that she carried in the silence of someone who could not ask for help, but refused to give up. Each hidden food was a renewed promise to her brother that she would do everything possible and impossible to keep him alive. It was because of him that his steps remained firm, that fear was swallowed daily, and that courage, even disguised as shyness, overcame exhaustion. At the end of the day, when I finally left through the back door, the cold of the night seemed to intensify the emotional weight of that routine. The backpack, though light in bulk, carried the value of his daily persistence. The empty streets and the shadows of the lampposts followed her path as she walked with her gaze always moving, ready to notice any sign of danger. The silence of the streets contrasted with the whirlwind of thoughts that occupied his mind. With each night that passed without being discovered, she felt a little more relieved, but never safe. The girl was fully aware that the owner of the restaurant, if he knew, could see her acts as theft. As much as his motivation was noble, for the adult world, the justification of saving a brother would not be enough in the face of the rules of work. This forced her to live permanently in this delicate balance between need and risk. Being fired would be the end of everything she had managed to build with so much effort. The restaurant, in the eyes of those who passed through its glass doors, was a symbol of abundance and success. The well-set tables, the exuberant dishes, and the irresistible aroma attracted a constant and demanding clientele. But for her, that place represented a daily battle fought behind the scenes, away from the satisfied eyes of those who enjoyed their meals there. Every corner of the room was familiar to him, each table a strategic point where he could perhaps find sustenance for that night. The coldness of the adults who surrounded her during the workday was a constant reminder of the loneliness in which she lived. Even among so many people, she remained invisible. None of the waiters, not even the cooks or attendants, stopped to say a word to him other than a brief order. His name was rarely pronounced. She was called only when they needed her, as if she were another functional object of that environment always in motion. Despite the harshness of that reality, the girl did not allow discouragement to overwhelm her. He found, in each small success, the strength to continue. The memory of her brother, waiting for her at home with his eyes shining even under the fatigue of the disease, was the daily fuel that made her face indifference and fear. No matter how invisible she was to the eyes of others, in her brother's eyes she was everything. There were nights when the restaurant's traffic slowed down earlier and customers left leaving dishes almost intact. On those days, she was able to gather a little more food, which allowed her to breathe with a little less anguish when feeding her brother. However, even in these moments of relative abundance, the care remained the same. The strategy of hiding the leftovers was never relaxed, as it would only take a single slip for all his effort to be discovered. The fear of being punished came not only from the possibility of losing her job, but also from the fear of seeing her brother suffer even more. Without the restaurant's food, he would be even weaker. The disease, which was already consuming him slowly, could advance more quickly if he became malnourished. Each piece of loaded bread hidden in the backpack represented more than food. It represented the hope of postponing suffering for another day. Even in the face of constant tension, The girl kept serenity on her face. His eyes, though laden with fatigue, reflected an early maturity. She had learned to protect herself from the inside, not to show weakness in front of the indifferent adults around her. As much as fear was present every second, the responsibility for keeping her brother alive overcame any other feeling. The owner of the restaurant, unbeknownst to her, began to accumulate suspicion when he noticed small details that had previously escaped him. His attentive eyes captured repetitive movements, the quick exits, the exaggerated care with the backpack. The pieces of this enigma began to fit into his mind, creating a picture that, little by little, fed curiosity and suspicion. As the girl repeated night after night her silent ritual of love and survival, the environment around her began to slowly transform. Something was about to change. The invisible thread that separated her from discovery became increasingly tenuous. Inside the restaurant, as the flow of customers followed its usual rhythm of orders and muffled laughter, the owner's eyes began to linger on small details that had hitherto gone unnoticed. At first, it was just a vague sensation, a discomfort, that arose almost instinctively. There was something about that girl that didn't entirely fit into the establishment's predictable routine. The first suspicions did not come from a concrete fact, but from a succession of small observations that, little by little, began to draw an uncomfortable restlessness in his mind. He noticed how she, at the end of the day, kept a constant hurry, always leaving with the same worn backpack on her back, which seemed a little fuller each night. He also observed the furtive glances he cast around him as he collected the leftovers from the tables, the subtle movements of his hands, as if calculating each gesture so as not to attract attention. There was a pattern, a meticulously repeated ritual that at first could be mistaken for simple zeal for cleanliness, but which, seen carefully, revealed something more. The doubt began to grow. The owner was not a man easily deceived. He built his business from hard work, constant vigilance, and the natural distrust of those who had learned to deal with difficulties from an early age. He was used to maintaining absolute control over everything that came in and out of the restaurant. He knew the value of each ingredient, each dish served, each penny collected. And now that seemingly harmless routine of the girl began to draw a scenario of possible losses that he was not willing to ignore. He was not a cruel man, but the business came before everything else. In his view, any deviation, even a small one, could open up space for greater abuse. He then began to pay even more attention. She noticed how, when collecting the dishes, she carefully chose what went straight to the trash and what was quickly accommodated inside the backpack. He saw how much he tried to keep his movements natural, always keeping an eye on who he might be watching. From that point on, her mind could no longer avoid the inevitable question: was she stealing? As much as his first reaction was one of distrust, there was also a twinge of curiosity in his chest. Something about that girl intrigued him. She had never given him any problems, never asked for raises, nor caused any discomfort to the other employees. She worked with discipline, accepted any task without complaint, always silent, always present. It was not the typical profile of someone who cheats for bad nature. Still, the clues were before him, piling up like pieces of an incomplete puzzle. The nights went by and the owner's attention only increased. He began to discreetly time the time it took her to leave. He watched how he avoided crossing eyes on the way out, how he quickly disappeared through the dark streets shortly after the restaurant closed. His restless mind began to formulate hypotheses. Maybe he was reselling food on the street. Maybe he fed other homeless people. Perhaps he was even stealing for some unknown purpose. There was also, behind all that surveillance, a mixture of pride and professional distrust. He didn't like to imagine that someone could circumvent his rules under his own roof. The restaurant was his domain, his livelihood, his legacy. Allowing anyone to deceive you was unacceptable, regardless of who it was. And yet there was something about that girl that prevented him from confronting her immediately. I wanted to first understand precisely what was happening before making any decisions. The restlessness was transformed into a plan. He decided that, to clear up any doubts, he would need to see her outside the restaurant, accompany her without being noticed, and finally, find out the fate of those leftovers that disappeared daily. He did not mention his plan to anyone. He didn't want comments, much less gossip among employees. It would be something done with absolute discretion. That night, when the work was finally over, he pretended to continue his affairs in the office, keeping an ear to the empty hall. She heard when the girl finished her cleaning, noticed the creaking of the back door opening and then closing behind her. It was time. He put on his coat, turned off the lights with minimal noise, and left minutes. Later, calculating the distance necessary not to be noticed, the cold of the night enveloped him as soon as he stepped on the sidewalk. In front of him, he saw the small silhouette of the girl following her usual path. She walked with firm and fast steps, as if she knew the route well and knew where she needed to go. He kept his backpack glued to his back, his thin arms pressed against his body in search of some warmth in his coat, too thin for that biting temperature. The owner followed a few meters behind, taking care to remain among the shadows of the buildings, dodging the few light poles that illuminated the wet sidewalks. The distant sound of cars passing on parallel streets filled the air with a constant hum, as footsteps echoed over the damp asphalt, creating a tense soundtrack to that silent chase. At each corner turned by the girl, the owner slowed down, sneaking, skillfully so as not to be noticed. He watched the path she took, entering increasingly deserted streets, moving away from commercial areas and approaching less frequented regions of the city. The buildings were changing their profile. Modern buildings gave way to old houses, abandoned sheds and narrow alleys, where the wind gained strength as it crossed cracks between the precarious buildings. The mystery increased with each meter traveled. He wondered what the destination of that walk would be. The further they went, the more evident it became that it was not something momentary or accidental. It was a solid, carefully constructed routine that she followed with precision, as if repeating that route every night without fail. Even wrapped in his own suspicions, the owner could not prevent a strange sensation from invading him. I no longer saw just a potentially dishonest employee, but rather a lonely child walking under the weight of something much greater than his frail shoulders could bear. And yet she moved forward, with determination, unwavering in the face of the darkness that surrounded her. With each step taken on that silent night, the enigma became even deeper, and he knew that, at the end of that journey, the truth would finally be revealed to him. The night plunged the city into a dense silence, broken only by the muffled sound of the girl's hurried footsteps, resounding against the damp asphalt of the narrow streets. The lights of the streetlights, spaced and dim, drew timid circles of light along the way, leaving large portions of shadow where the cold seemed even more intense. The illuminated windows and the buzz of restaurants had been left behind, now replaced by silent alleys, graffiti walls and weathered facades. The girl advanced with firm but attentive steps. His small body seemed even smaller inside the thin coat, and the backpack, carefully attached to his back, swayed slightly with each movement. Even in the daily routine of that crossing, she carried within her a constant fear, as if the wind itself could give her away. Darkness seemed to watch her, and the occasional crackling sound from old windows or distant barking only fueled that quiet tension that accompanied her around every corner. Behind her, at a safe distance, the owner of the restaurant walked in. Absolute silence. Her eyes, accustomed to controlling the busy room during the day, now adapted to the dim light, attentive to every detail of the girl's movements. He kept himself strategically in the dark corners, dodging small puddles of water that could betray his presence with an unnecessary splash. He breathed in a restrained way, measuring his own pace so as not to reduce the distance too much and be noticed, but also not to lose sight of it in that labyrinth of alleys and narrow passages. Suspense seemed to take over everything around. Each new block traveled increased the mystery. The walk was not random, that was already clear to him. There was a well-defined destiny in the girl's mind, a path that her feet already knew, as if they were engraved on it. This was not an impulsive adventure, but a calculated routine executed with precision and care. The more he followed her, the more curiosity gnawed at him inside. What did she do with those leftovers? Where did he go night after night? Who was waiting for her at the end of that secret journey? Her breathing became noticeably heavier as the route lengthened. Maybe it was the weight of the backpack, maybe the latent fear that always accompanied it like a second skin. From time to time, the girl would cast quick glances over her shoulder, checking if she was really alone. Each of these brief inspections made the owner's heart race, forcing him to retreat for a moment and hold his breath, hiding better among the shadows, like a predator that could not be noticed. The alleys were getting narrower and narrower. The pavement was no longer uniform. Loose cobblestones required her to be careful in her steps, and from the pursuer, even more attention not to be betrayed by the sound of an unstable stone. The air seemed denser there, laden with moisture and the faint odor of the sleeping city. No human voice cut through that silence, and even the distant traffic seemed to have been swallowed up by the weight of dawn. The tension increased like a wire stretched to the maximum, ready to break. The owner, firm in his purpose, felt the strange mixture of anxiety and discomfort. The further he went, the more he realized that the outcome of that persecution would not be simple. The initial image of a possible child thief began to dissolve, replaced by an even larger enigma. That dark scenario in which she ventured every night did not match the profile of someone acting out of greed or malice. There was something else, something he still couldn't decipher, but that pressed him to discover. The girl crossed a wider, almost deserted street and entered another narrow passage, flanked by high walls covered with moss and cracks. Ahead, the pale glow of an old lamp partially illuminated a fork, casting elongated shadows that danced on the uneven floor. She followed one side without hesitation, which only reinforced the idea that she knew every inch of that route. As he followed her, the owner felt the weight of responsibility on his own shoulders. It was no longer about protecting your restaurant from a small financial loss. Now it was a dive into uncharted territory, into a story that completely escaped the cold logic of business. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he did not have absolute control of the situation, and this bothered him deeply. The constructions were decreasing as the girl approached what seemed to be the end of the route. The light almost didn't reach that part of the city anymore. Small shacks appeared in sight, set up in an improvised way, like urban scars hidden in the bowels of the metropolis. Fragile tin roofs, walls patched with planks of different sizes, improvised curtains covering the entrances. It was a scenario of complete abandonment, of social invisibility taken to the extreme. The owner watched now with a heavy heart as the girl slowed her pace, approaching a small shack at the end of the alley. His hand automatically sought the zipper of the backpack, making sure that the precious contents were still safe. Before entering, she paused for a brief moment and cast one last glance around, as if confirming for the last time that no one was following her. He did not notice the motionless silhouette of the man mingled with the darkness of a distant corner. There, in front of that fragile and silent shelter, the thread of tension seemed about to break. The owner felt the blood pulsing in his ears. His stomach contracted. What was behind that thin door? Who expected it? And even more, what would he do when he finally discovered the truth? The girl pushed the wooden door, which creaked slightly, and disappeared inside the shack. Outside, the owner remained motionless for a few seconds that seemed eternal, watching the faint light of a small candle flicker through the crack in the poorly fitted door. He took a deep breath. He knew that he was about to witness what he already intuited from afar, but which at the same time he could not, or did not want to, fully believe. The owner remained motionless in the dim light, watching the fragile structure before his eyes. The shack looked even smaller and more vulnerable up close. The warped planks formed crooked walls, supported by improvisations that barely protected their occupants from the relentless force of winter. The cracks let out the faint light of the small candle lit inside, flickering with each current of wind that crossed the gaps with ease. The cold seemed even more intense there, as if the air itself carried the weight of that reality invisible to most. Inside, the girl knelt carefully on the dirt floor, which was covered only by pieces of cardboard, fragile attempts to create a minimum separation between the damp ground and the few belongings scattered around the small space. The backpack, which she had carried so carefully during the journey, was placed alongside, and with slow, delicate movements, she began to pull out the hidden contents. The wrapped pieces of bread, the still hot rice from the precisely collected Leftovers, a small portion of carefully packed meat. In the corner of the room, on a worn, sunken mattress, rested his brother. Her eyes were half closed. Her pale, thin skin seemed almost translucent under the dim lighting. The bones bounced out from under the stretched skin, denouncing the long battle against disease and malnutrition. His parched lips trembled slightly, while his slender body tried to find some comfort under the threadbare blanket that could barely warm him. Even fragile, the boy sketched a slight movement when he noticed his sister's presence, as if the mere fact of seeing her already brought a little relief. The girl sat next to him, with a naturalness that showed how much that scene was part of her routine. There was a mixture of tenderness and discipline in her gestures. He did not show despair, but meticulous care, as someone who learned at a very early age that despair does not bring answers, it only consumes strength. Before starting to feed him, she checked the temperature of his forehead with the back of his hand, assessing whether the fever had decreased since the last visit. Then she moistened his lips with a small piece of wet cloth, trying to relieve the dryness caused by the constant fever. The owner watched everything from a distance, unable to take his eyes off the silent and painful scene. The weight of discovery began to crush the space that had previously been occupied by mistrust. That was not a thief. He was not a malicious child seeking advantage. Before him was, quite simply, a desperate sister, fighting with all her strength and limited resources to keep that little piece of her family alive. All the rigidity with which he had built his suspicions dissolved there, under the brutal weight of the truth, exposed in gestures so simple and, at the same time, so grandiose. The girl, with her thin and deft hands, began to offer small portions of food to her brother. Each spoonful was administered with patience, respecting the fragile rhythm of the boy, who swallowed with difficulty, but with evident effort to respond to his sister's care. His eyes, even dimmed by fever, sought in hers a silent security, a thread of hope that still held them together in the daily battle against disease and hunger. The surrounding environment revealed the extent of the fighting. There was no furniture, just a few boxes serving as improvised support. In one corner, a few rusty kitchen utensils rested next to a basin of clean water. On one of the boxes, a cracked glass and a chipped plate, carefully washed and ready to be used again. On top of the mattress, an old teddy bear, faded by time, stood beside the boy like a silent companion of lonely nights. The owner's breathing became heavy, not from physical exertion, but from the emotional impact of that discovery. His eyes, hardened by years of tough negotiations and business decisions, now burned with the force of compassion that emerged unexpectedly in his chest. What he had thought was a security problem at the restaurant turned out to be, in fact, a silent cry for help from a child who, with no alternatives, was doing what he could to protect his brother. Every movement of the girl carried an almost sacred weight. There was a pure demonstration of love, of absolute sacrifice, of raw courage. With no one to support her, no structure, no assistance, she had created her own survival system, made up of hidden pieces of food and a lot of inner strength. And there, in the face of that situation of extreme vulnerability, the owner realized how small his own worries seemed. The silence of the night enveloped the shack, making that scene even more solemn. The flame of the small candle flickered, casting soft shadows on the crooked walls, as if it also witnessed the depth of that moment. Outside, the owner remained motionless, absorbing every detail with eyes that could no longer maintain their initial coolness. The biting wind passed between the loose planks and over his shoulders, but he did not move. His mind replayed every night he had suspected the girl, every time he had considered confronting her, every snap judgment. Now, in the face of the open truth, a new question began to form within him, loaded with weight and responsibility. What would he do from there? The dawn wind continued to blow hard, causing the boards of the shack to crackle in low, steady wails. The owner of the restaurant remained still, motionless in front of the scene that now burned in his memory with an intensity that he could not contain. As much as the cold cut through her skin, her body seemed to feel nothing but the crushing weight of the revelation she witnessed. Every little gesture of that girl, every careful movement with which she fed her brother, was like a blade slowly passing through its own certainties. As his eyes roamed every corner of that precarious shelter, The thick layers of judgment that he had built himself for days began to crumble one by one. It was not possible to remain oblivious in the face of such dedication. There was no more room for the assumptions that had previously fueled his distrust. The image he had carried of her until that night, the girl he suspected of stealing, who he watched with rigid, cold eyes, now seemed distant, almost absurd. Another image began to emerge in the man's mind. Images that until then he himself had tried to forget, locked in the secret drawers of his memory. Images of his own childhood, so different from the comfortable routine he now sustained with his successful business. He had also known scarcity, the fear of not having anything to eat the next day, the worried look of his mother trying to multiply crumbs of food to feed her children. She remembered the smell of humidity on cold nights, the emptiness in her stomach, the tears hidden under the makeshift pillow. He remembered the shame of reaching out, of hearing the silence in the face of calls for help. As much as life had changed its destiny over the years, behind the rigid man, there was still that scared boy who, for a long time, had known what it meant to depend on the goodwill of others to survive. And now, before him, was an even more fragile version of this story. A child alone, with no one around, sustaining with superhuman strength what little he had left. His brother, the last link to what had once been family. The internal conflict consumed him. In part, he felt ashamed that he had allowed his distrust to blind him for so long. He wondered how many times, as the girl hurriedly walked after work, he had been in the comfort of his office, reviewing numbers, never imagining the drama that unfolded every night in the shadows of the city. On the other hand, the compassion that was now emerging was powerful, almost overwhelming. There was no way to pretend that he had not seen what he had seen. There was no way to pretend that it was a distant problem. His heart, hardened by the pragmatism of business, began to be pierced by a light that he himself no longer expected to feel, the genuine need to do something, to intervene, to reach out, a real hand. For the first time in a long time, the instinct for absolute control gave way to a much stronger impulse, that of caring. As he continued to watch the girl repeat her silent gesture of love, he felt something inside him reorganize. That was no longer a professional dilemma. It wasn't about rules. It wasn't about loss. It wasn't about discipline. It was about humanity, about compassion, about not allowing two children to carry alone the weight of a pain that no adult should have to bear. The questions began to turn into decisions. He no longer thought of reprimand, punishment, or warnings. In his mind, he already mentally traced the first actions. How could you help them? Where to start? How to ensure that that boy, so fragile and vulnerable, had access to a doctor, medicines, decent food? How could that girl who crossed the city daily with the strength she had left finally be allowed to rest, knowing that she would no longer need to hide crumbs to survive? The possibilities expanded before him like a new path, full of alternatives that he now saw clearly. It wouldn't be easy. The bureaucracy, the difficulties, the costs, all of that would exist, but none of these barriers seemed too big in the face of the urgency of what he witnessed. For the first time in a long time, he felt he needed to do something, not because it was his business obligation, but because it was the right thing to do. The air was still cold, the planks still creaked, and the candle inside flickered. The boy, after a few spoonfuls, seemed to fall asleep again, lulled by the gentle touch of his sister, who caressed his hair with the same patience as someone who had already learned to love in silence. The girl kept her eyes fixed on him, watching his fragile sleep, not realizing that outside a powerful decision had just been born. As he took a last look inside the shack, the owner of the restaurant turned slowly, feeling that from that moment on, nothing would be the same as before. The night gave way to a grey dawn, one of those in which the sun seems to hesitate before fully rising. The first lights timidly invaded the city, drawing long shadows on the still damp and silent streets. The owner of the restaurant, after hours, with the weight of that discovery crossing his chest, had not slept his eyes. His mind had worked tirelessly throughout the night, sowing thoughts, going over details, elaborating possibilities. Now, with the day taking shape outside, the decision was already made within him. There would be no more room for postponements. The restaurant opened its doors like any other day. Customers began to arrive, employees took their positions, the smell of fresh coffee and hot bread filled the room again, as if everything was exactly the same. But inside him, everything had changed. His eyes searched for the girl among the hurried movement of the hall. She appeared as always, punctual, with a simple uniform, a worn-out backpack on her back and the calm countenance of someone who carried much more than the world could imagine. She cleaned the tables with the same restrained agility, trying not to be noticed, focused on her task as she did every day. This time, however, the gaze that fell on her no longer carried suspicion. It was another kind of attention, loaded with a weight that only he knew at that moment. There was something solemn about the way I watched her now, something that mixed respect, compassion, and responsibility, and deep down a persistent restlessness reminded him that this morning would not end like all the others. At the end of the day, when the last customers had left and the salon was once again plunging into the silence that preceded closing, he called her. Her voice, usually firm and objective, now carried a different, almost gentle tone that caused the girl to look up for a brief moment, surprised by the unexpected change. Not understanding why, she followed him discreetly to the small office at the back of the restaurant. There, the environment was simple, with stacks of papers organized in boxes, an old telephone on the table, and a narrow window through which the light entered timidly. But unlike other times, there was something different about that conversation. He didn't talk about tasks or schedules or work. Instead, she did something the girl never imagined she would hear. He offered help. The initial surprise quickly gave way to a mixture of relief and confusion. I wasn't being reprimanded, I wasn't being fired. On the contrary. For the first time in a long time, someone saw what existed behind his tired eyes. He proposed to take her along with her brother to a doctor. She offered fresh food, secured safe shelter and assistance that until then seemed as distant as the stars she saw at night when she returned home. A few hours later, the small shack that had been their only refuge for so long was being left behind. In its place, a new path began to form. The brother, carried with care, was taken to a simple but welcoming hospital where he would finally receive the care they so desperately needed. The doctor, when examining him, realized the seriousness of the situation, but also saw that there was time. There was still hope. The first days were of adaptation. The girl, used to dealing with everything alone, now had to accept that she no longer needed to hide or fight in silence. For the first time in a long time, there was enough food on the table. Fresh food, specially prepared to strengthen the brother, was served daily. His eyes, previously dull and empty, gradually regained the childlike glow that time and illness had consumed. With the proper treatment, the right medications, and a reinforced diet, the boy began to regain strength. The constant fever subsided, the skin gained color, and the smiles, once rare, began to appear again on their faces. The owner of the restaurant, now closer, followed each small advance with a look loaded with a satisfaction different from the one he knew in his business routine. It was not the pride of accomplished goals, but the relief of seeing two lives which could have been lost in the silence of the city gain a new chance. Gradually, the routine was reorganized. The girl, relieved of the unbearable weight she had carried for so long, began to attend the school she had seen for years only from afar. Books, once distant, were now part of his new reality. His brother, still recovering, began to play, smile, and discover what it was like to be a child without the constant threat of hunger or disease hanging over his head. Inside the restaurant, the mood had also changed. That story, initially known only to the owner, ended up spreading discreetly among the closest employees. Respect and admiration for the girl grew. She was no longer seen only as the cleaning girl, but as a silent example of strength and love. Small gestures of affection appeared in everyday life, whether in kind words, in looks of encouragement, or even in plates of food carefully prepared and sent to the brother. The owner, in turn, experienced an even greater transformation. That decision, initially made in the midst of shock and commotion, now turned out to be one of the most significant of his life. He discovered in himself a sensitivity that had long been dormant. I realized how small actions, which for some would seem like simple gestures, had the power to redesign entire destinies. Even with the natural difficulties of the new phase, the girl now carried something that she had previously lacked: security. He knew that he no longer had to run through the dark streets or hide food in old backpacks, or worry daily about the risk of losing everything at any moment. For the first time since she had lost her parents, she experienced the comfort of having someone by her side, an adult willing to protect them, to take care of them, to ensure that tomorrow was no longer an uncertain territory. And so, between doctor's appointments, hot meals, and new school notebooks, life began to be rewritten, as if the scars of the past were little by little covered by layers of renewed hope. The nights no longer brought only cold and fear. Now they were filled with stories, restrained laughter, and dreams that, until then, seemed forbidden. And, in the heart of that girl, who for so long walked invisibly through the streets of the city, a certainty began to grow. The weight of survival no longer needed to be carried alone. How many times in the rush of our days do we look at someone without imagining the silent battle that person is facing? The story of this girl and her brother reminds us that often a simple gesture of empathy can be what separates despair from hope. Today they are still together, studying, dreaming, building a future that once seemed distant. And it all started when someone finally saw beyond appearances. If this story touched your heart, write here in the comments, "I choose to see the other with compassion." Element. It's always exciting to know who got here with me. Also, take the opportunity to leave your like. This shows that these stories make sense and helps me bring even more content like this. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that make us reflect and often change the way we look at the world. There's a video here on the side that tells a similar story, and I'm sure it will move you too. Click and stay with me there.